today we have our own very special speaker, Mark Algee-Hewitt, who's Assistant Professor of Digital Humanities in the Department of English, the university's first post holder in the field of digital humanities, and the director of the Literary Lab, which itself runs 20+ projects, all of which Mark takes care of, as well as doing his full-time job as a professor and researcher. He is incredibly well known globally for his work on agenda setting, quantitative textual analysis, digital humanities that involve quantitative textual tools, very exciting things that they do in the Lit Lab, so just look it up and you'll see all sorts of stuff that they're doing. And so we're delighted to have him talk about distributed character quantitative models of the English stage, 1500 to 1920. That's quite a long remit for however many minutes. And let's welcome Mark Algee-Hewitt.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Elaine. I'm not sure I agree with everything that you said, but enough of it that I'm willing to go on. And thank you all for coming to hear this. I'm excited about this project. I know a couple of you have seen an earlier stage of this before, but it's one of those projects that walks the line between something I'm interested in doing myself and a literary lab project. As you'll be able to see, it's taken its cues from some of the work that we've done in the lab, and yet I think I put a couple of spins on it that are all of my own. I also want to say at the beginning that although as you can see, I put my name on the project. A lot of what I'm doing here wouldn't be possible without the assistance of one of the many, many very, very talented CESTA undergraduate research assistants, in particular Lise Wallenetz, who works in the Literary Lab and has worked with me specifically on early modern English drama, has been absolutely essential the work that was done on this project. So I wanted to make sure that at the outset you realize that although this is less so of most of what I present, this, as with everything else in the digital humanities, is very much a group effort. So this paper, this presentation, is an experiment in a new form, or what I'm going to claim is a new form of dramatic criticism, one that depends on digital or quantitative approaches to the structure and, more importantly, what I'm going to call the morphology of the play. That is, I want to look at the specific set of relationships between characters viewed simultaneously as a whole, rather than as a series, a temporal series of one-on-one interactions. The structures, this series of interactions, both the dramatic interactions as well as the social universe of the play. In transforming the drama into a new quantitative object, obviously network, I want to examine what the overall structure of the play can tell us, both about the aesthetics of a literary production during a given period, and what we can learn about the play by disaggregating the morphology from both the stagecraft and the language that until now have made up the two poles of dramatic criticism. Now, make no mistake, both of these aspects are inherent in the approach that I propose here. In fact, the structures that I'll be discussing are, if anything, emergent from these aspects of dramatic creation or performance. However, by deliberately foregrounding the dramatic structure, by reading it at scales, both within plays and between plays, that are impossible through traditional criticism, by reading it, in other words, distantly. My goal is to uncover large-scale trends that speak to the importance of specific moments of dramatic creation within the scope of much larger historical transformations. Now, the use of networks to represent something that we might call character space, or the literary social sphere, is perhaps one of the more common tropes of quantitative textual analysis. Intuitive to understand as a representation of social interactions within a literary space, networks, such as, for example, this one of the character interactions in David Copperfield, offer a powerful visualization tool for understanding the relationships between a large group of characters in, for example, a novel. And yet, our interest in networks focuses strongly on their ability to represent characters. But characters themselves can more easily and informatively be represented by a list, an index, a summary description. It's not the characters, I want to say, that networks represent so well, but rather their interactions. the network is constructed out of the spaces in between the characters. To paraphrase Bruno Latour's actor network theory from Reassembling the Social, the sociality of the actor network happens not in the nodes, in the characters or the people, but in the edges, in the interaction that they mediate. My invocation of Latour here is deliberate, because what I want to suggest is that our use of networks, entirely focused as they typically are on characters, on nodes, conceals much more meaningful critical phenomena in the edges that connect it. The power of the network model is not just in visualization. In fact, network visualization, in its limited dimensionality, conceals far more than it reveals. Rather, the power of networks lie in their precise mathematic description of a set of relationships that they can quantify, measure, and aggregate in ways that are unavailable to the reader of text. It is the numerical properties of edges that allow us to calculate the meaningful statistics of the nodes, including centrality, connectedness, robustness, communities, etc. Thinking through networks as numerical objects focused on interactions lets us make much larger claims about the social worlds that they represent in the pages of a book, or as I'll show you here, on stage. Now, this approach, studying plays as networks, has been pioneered by others, not least by Franco Moretti in the Literary Lab's own pamphlet number 2, who uses this network of Hamlet to think through the regions of the plot and the roles played by characters at the core and the periphery of the drama. But by his own admission, in a classic Moretti move, his network turns quickly from the quantitative network analysis to the qualitative approach to the plot. Here, I want to push the quantitative aspect of the network further and look not just at what one network of a play can tell us, but what many networks and the metrics that they offer can tell us about many plays across 400 years of English dramatic history. This approach, as I hope to show, will allow me to not only pose large-scale questions about the structure of the social interactions and the morphology of English dramatic history, but also answer much more local questions about the similarities and discontinuities in play structure across time. For example, the legacy of Shakespeare and his influence and importance to subsequent generations of playwrights. To argue that the Romantic reception and appropriation of Shakespeare serves as a synecdoche of the early 19th century understanding of the early modern drama is to understate, for example, the importance given to Shakespeare by critics, both English and continental, of the period. As you can see here in his lectures on dramatic art and literature, August Wilhelm Schlegel, speaking for the German Jena Romantic movement, not only reduces Elizabethan and Jacobean drama to Shakespeare, but argues that he's the only dramatist of note in English literary history. For the German Romantic, Shakespeare, standing between the ancient freedom of the Greeks and the mannered dramatic rules of contemporary French culture, perfectly articulated the Romantic compromise between the ancient and the modern, or in Friedrich Schiller terms, the naive and the sentimental. For Schlegel, Shakespeare offered the creative mixture and generic blending that is characteristic of Romanticism. Quote, the expression of secret attention to a chaos which lies concealed in the very bosom of the ordered universe that approaches more to the secret of the universe. Given the problem of translation, Schlegel pushes back against Shakespeare scholarship that prioritizes language innovation and instead reappropriates the formal aspects of his drama into the Romantic project, a move echoed by Coleridge in England. What is crucial to note is that Shakespeare, in this sense, is not a unique and ahistorical genius, but is very much a product of his time. Shakespeare's, quote, free original communication and healthy vigor is a consequence of the absence of the, what we understand in French, artificial polish and insipid uniformity of certain rules from English culture, and by extension from drama. Far from standing apart from his contemporaries of the late 16th, early 17th centuries, Shakespeare is the exemplar of the nascent romanticism of his period, linking, in Schlegel's terms, the sociocultural values and transformations of the turn of the 17th century in England with the same motifs that the German Romantics witnessed in Germany at the beginning of the 19th century. My goal in using a historical network analysis to address this local question of romantic drama is to put pressure on this history of reception and ask if the formal aspects of Shakespeare's drama share structural or formal features with the dramatic or poetic writing of the early 19th century. And how do these structures change over time? The answer to these questions, I argue, lies beyond both the visual logic in the stage and the literary logic of language, and in what I'm going to suggest is the computational logic of the network. Now, I should say that since I'm going to be building up some slightly more complicated network metrics, I think it's worthwhile for me to think through with you the basics of those. So I apologize for those of you that are super familiar with network theory that some of this is going to get basic, but I promise you, traditional Mark style, it's going to ramp up in difficulty pretty quickly. But feel free either to tell me to move along or to ask me. So a network functions as an abstract representation of relationships between entities that are connected by a series of logically consistent features. Here, for example, is King Henry V as a network. It's constructed of nodes, which represent here the objects of the network, computers on the internet, for example, or people in a social network here, characters in the play, and edges, the principles of connections between the nodes. Now, it's important to emphasize that networks are ideal for understanding relationships between objects, or in Latour's terms, actors, and by reducing the features to points of connection, the network reveals structural, or when visualized, morphological patterns of latent relationships at the expense of detailed information about each node, beyond the principles of connection between them. In this project, I represent plays as networks, here Shakespeare's on Henry V, in order to better understand their formal characteristics. In all of the networks that I'll discuss today, nodes will be characters, and edges will be the number of speeches exchanged between two characters in the drama. Now, there are a number of different ways that I could have done this, and I've explored networks that instead of assigning edges as the number of speeches, instead assign edges and weight them according to the number of words exchanged. But for reasons that I'll get into later, this is the form of all of the networks that I'll be talking about today. Nodes as characters, number of speeches connecting them. And you'll note that the edges are directional. They have an arrow. That is the number of times that Pistol speaks to Henry V versus the number of times that Henry V speaks to Pixtel are represented by two edges that are over top of each other. So you can't really see them, but trust me, they're there. So the thickness of the arrows, or the edges, are scaled to the number of speeches between each play. The thicker the arrow, the more speeches those two characters exchange. The network then allows us to visualize the entire set of social relationships based on who talks to who and how much as a proxy for the relationships in the text. The colors here represent communities in the play, groups of characters who belong to the same network neighborhoods based on the pattern of their interactions. Now, I want to introduce two concepts into the discussion, two ways of understanding what it means to be a central character based upon networks: eigenvector centrality and betweenness centrality. Now, centrality itself is a straightforward concept. The number of edges in or out that a character has, the total number, in other words, of other characters that he or she interacts with, is the raw centrality of that character, and can approximate, I want to suggest, a measurement of how important that character is to the play overall. The two specific centralities that I want to look at today nuance that idea of importance, asking not just what characters are the most important, but what their function of that performance is within the network of interactions. Eigenvector centrality measures not just which node has the most links, but which nodes are central to communities with a large number of links overall. So here, for example, in this toy network, you can see this node and this node. Now, based on just raw centrality, both of them are connected by 4 edges to other groups of characters. But if we actually resize the network for eigenvector centrality, you can see that the guy in the center, girl in the center, is much, much bigger than the one on the edge. And this is because eigenvector centrality detects not just who has the most connections, but who has the most connections to other nodes that also have the most connections. So in other words, knowing a lot of people who are popular does much better for your eigenvector centrality than knowing a lot of people that really aren't popular. I joke, but in fact, eigenvector centrality is used frequently in social networks to measure clicks within different groups of people. Betweenness centrality measures something slightly different. Instead of looking at local groups of characters, betweenness centrality measures the importance of characters to the network overall. If, in other words, one seeks to chart a path between one part of the network to another part of the network, or, more importantly, as we'll see, between one subnetwork and another subnetwork, the betweenness centrality of each node is the number of possible paths that pass through that node. So here, for example, you can see this node in the center. To get from any node on the right half of the network to any node on the left, or vice versa, you have to pass through that character. So if we resize the nodes based on betweenness centrality, as you can see, that is the node with the highest betweenness. If eigenvector centrality measures clicks, that is characters who are central to certain groups within the play, betweenness centrality measures characters who bridge or mediate between those groups. It's the difference between these measurements, when it exists, that I really want to examine. Now, using these two metrics, it's possible to identify different kinds of plays, a topology of centrality that reveals the different functions of characters within particular kinds of dramatic networks. The first is exemplified by a play we have already seen, and which I assure you, you will get sick of seeing because it's a really great example of a lot of Shakespeare's Henry V. Measuring the network for eigenvector centrality, again, as before, through the sides of the nodes, so the bigger the node, the higher the eigenvector centrality, reveals, of course, that the king is the most central character, as his importance outweighs all others. If we measure the betweenness centrality, Henry not only remains the most important character, but actually becomes more important. In the history play, the person of the monarch fulfills both roles, the central character of his group, and here you can see there's only one group, but also the character that connects all of the others. In such a play, we might say there is only one community, and it is centered in all ways on the king. The second type is apparent in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Here, the four lovers dominate the play as their interconnectedness with each other and with the court give them outsized importance. This suggests that eigenvector centrality reveals, among other things, the protagonist of the play. When we switch to betweenness centrality, something very different happens. Here, the four lovers caught in a community all of their own are reduced in importance. And it's both Theseus and, interestingly, Bottom that take on a new significance. It's they who do the work of bringing the communities together. Theseus, because he mediates between the world of the lovers and the world of the court, and Bottom, because he mediates between the world of the fairies and the world of the humans. In fact, it's Bottom, the fool of the play, that has the highest betweenness centrality, not the protagonist, but perhaps in his bridging function, a character that mediates the audience's own experience. Now, in the final type, exemplified here by Julius Caesar, Brutus is, of course, revealed as the primary protagonist through his large eigenvector centrality, with Cassius Caesar and Antony close behind. Now, when we move to betweenness centrality, the other characters drop out, leaving Brutus alone as the central mediating figure, speaking not just to his dual roles, which he shares with Henry, but more so to the changing roles of the other characters. Unlike Henry V, Caesar offers many communities with key characters within them, but just one that can move between the communities, Brutus. So far then, the two metrics that I've introduced give us a way to categorize plays in terms of their network morphology. This is a measurement of form, of the kind that Schlegel describes that operates outside of language, staging, or even genre, although I'm going to nuance that a bit, and points to a very different way of understanding dramatic form, one that is only available to the kind of quantitative analysis that I present here. But more than just locally categorizing plays, we can make these measurements without visualizing the network, allowing us to explore how they change in relation to each other at a much, much larger scale. For this experiment, I drew upon the Chadwick-Healy corpus of drama, part of the Literature Online corpus from ProQuest. The texts of this corpus were hand-entered to ensure accuracy, and the whole thing consists of 3,895 plays written between 1280 and 1992. Now, since I'm interested in the transformations of dramatic form from the early modern period to the 19th century, I restricted the corpus to plays written between 1550 and 1900. As you can see, this still leaves me with 3,529 plays. Plays earlier than that are both sparse and really complicated, because it turns out medieval drama is nothing like early modern drama in a whole lot of important ways. And after 1900, we run into problems of copyright, which is why I cut it off there. So the question that I want to ask is what can we learn by measuring these two centralities across time and in many different ways? Now, to address the problem of scale, that is the one that Moretti himself ran into when it comes to actually making networks, individual networks for plays within a corpus this large, I derived an algorithm to parse the Chadwick-Healy corpus and automatically generate character interaction networks from the XML. The XML markup includes tag sets for characters as well as speeches and speakers, but not recipients. It also uses a set of nested div tags to divide the play into acts and scenes, if applicable, and also marks stage directions with a separate set of nested tags. I'd like to point out that the Chadwick-Healy XML is uniquely terrible, operating as it does as a really bad HTML with no standard tags for anything other than speeches. So in a play with acts but no scenes, the scenes will be like div1 tags, but if there are scenes, acts will be div1 and scenes will be div2, and sometimes div2 will just be a random speech that's in rhyme in the middle of a play for no apparent reason. So there was a lot of nuanced parsing that the XML kind of glosses over. So the system I created to generate the network simply uses the existing markup to assign speeches to speakers and then follows a series of rules to guess at the recipient of the speech. Since most of the sets of interactions within dramas are actually one-on-one conversations, in this system, the recipient is always the previous person who has spoken before a given speech, unless there has been an intervening action or act scene break, in which case the recipient is the next person. In other words, if you have someone that speaks, the algorithm I have here assumes that the person who previously spoke is probably who that person is speaking to. However, if there's an intervening action, which is mostly a character enter or leaving, or if there is a scene or an act break before, it guesses that the recipient is the next person. And if, in fact, that person is isolated on both sides, it assumes that either, if there's a lot of people on stage, that person is addressing everyone, or if there's no one on stage, it's going to be a monologue and that person is addressing him or herself. Monologues I attributed as self-addresses to differentiate them from points where it specifically says that a character addresses the audience. So I'm assuming that a monologue is given to the audience in the same way that every other speech is given to the audience. And only when the audience is actually named as a recipient does the audience become a character within the show. As you can see, by cross-checking the results of a select few plays against a hand-tagged corpus, I've estimated the error rate of this process to be between 2 and 5%, depending upon the period of the drama. So actually, not too bad. The algorithm also resolves character-to-character co-references by ascertaining which abbreviated names are subsets of other names or titles. Actually, there's a really interesting literary historical thing that had to go on here, because as it turns out, as I'm sure it'll be no surprise to many of you, if a character is abbreviated simply through a single name, say Lord Sneerwell or Mr. Horner, abbreviated as Horner or Sneerwell, it's always going to be the male. Females are always abbreviated with a title plus last name, regardless of whether or not there is a Mr. Sneerwell to match Mrs. So part of the co-reference resolution had to look at which characters had titles in their abbreviations, in order to figure out whether or not they were the male or female member of a couple within the character. So with the dramas tagged automatically, I am able to measure the features that I described before, the eigenvector and behavior centrality, on the scale of the corpus rather than the scale of the individual play. So, in the first set of features that I'm interested, they have to do with the aspects of centrality, and they're related to what I'm going to call protagonism. That is, they are metrics that function how the protagonist is distributed across the play. That is, I'm imagining the protagonist not as a single character, but as a function within the network that can either be performed by a single character or distributed across many characters. One protagonist, many protagonists. There are two metrics that I'm interested in here, both related to the eigenvector centrality. Now, as eigenvector centrality is a distribution over the characters in a play, frequently an exponential distribution, a simple statistic such as the mean eigenvector centrality fails to capture the nuance of this feature at the scale of the corpus. So the first summary statistic that I use is the Gini coefficient of eigenvector centrality. It's originally designed to measure income inequality within an economic system. The Gini coefficient is a single number between 0 and 1 that indicates how evenly a set of resources, wealth, income, or in this case, centrality, is distributed across a population. Here are population characters. A score of 0 indicates perfect equality, where all characters have the same eigenvector centrality, while a score of 1 indicates perfect inequality, where a small number of characters, or actually a single character, do all of the talking. The second metric is the percentage of characters in the top quartile of the eigenvector centrality distribution. This measures the size of the core of the play. A play such as Henry V, whose eigenvector centrality distribution you can see here on the left, it's a little fuzzy, you don't really know what the numbers are, but each one of these dots is a character, and this is the distribution of centrality. So the giant Henry V in the middle of that network is because this is him here, this is eigenvector centrality, and everyone else is way down here. So both in terms of the Gini score, there's one character with the lion's share of centrality, and everyone else has very little. I also measured, this is metric number 2, the percentage of characters in the top quartile of the eigenvector centrality distribution. That is, if this is the core and this is the periphery, how many characters are in the core? So the Gini core really tells core and periphery. The second metric, percentage, tells how big the core is. Here the core is 1, and everybody else not so much. Over in A Midsummer Night's Dream, you can see there's a much slower fall off followed by a really quick drop off. So actually, most characters have a really, really low eigenvector centrality, whereas there are 5 characters with a relatively high eigenvector. And so if you cut it off the top quartile, there are actually 3 characters in the play who comprise what I'm calling core. So with metric number 2, that's really what I'm going to call protagonism proper. The higher the number, the more the tendency of the play to split the role of the protagonist between multiple characters. So the play networks themselves reveal the utility of these metrics. In the network we've already seen of Henry V, we can see that the relatively high Gini coefficient, here it's 0.64, speaks to the much smaller core, which is mostly just Henry himself, and a large number of periphery characters. While the extremely low quartile percentage suggests that only one character, again Henry, is the protagonist of the play, or at least he accrues all of the centrality. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the Gini coefficient of 0.78 is actually much higher, indicating that, in fact, there is a larger periphery relative to the core in this text. Yet the top quartile eigenvector percentage, which is 0.1, is an order of magnitude higher than in the history play, suggesting that there are multiple characters who share the function of the protagonist, in this case, the 4 lovers. Finally, just to show you a really different example, in Congreve's The Way of the World, both metrics change drastically. The very, very low Gini coefficient of 0.44 speaks to the relative disappearance of low centrality characters, or the disappearance of the entire periphery of the play, while the very high quartile percentage of 0.19 suggests the extent to which the remaining characters in the core share the function of the protagonist among themselves. That this restoration comedy was written over a century after Shakespeare's work and has such a radically different protagonism metric is not, as you will see, coincidence. Because if we turn from a single play to the Gini coefficient measurement in the entire corpus as a whole, we can see a clear historical pattern being out. Here, each dot is a play in the corpus, and its position on the y-axis is the Gini coefficient of the network for that play. Again, the higher it is, the bigger the distance between the core and the periphery, so small core, giant periphery. The lower it is, big core, smaller periphery. So over time, between 1550 and 1900, which is the range, the historical range of this graph, the Gini coefficients of the play exhibit a clear downward trend from plays with a small core and a large non-central periphery in the early century to plays with a relatively large core and a small periphery in the 18th and 19th centuries. Recoloring the graph to show the relative position of 6 canonical authors, this pattern is revealed. You probably can't make it out, but pink here is Shakespeare, purple is Ben Jonson, green is Dryden, orange is Aphra Behn, red is Fielding, and blue is the Romantic playwright Joanna Baillie. Bidding the results into 50-year periods, although I should say so that each one of these segments is one of the 50-year periods, but within that 50-year, I've maintained the historical trajectory. So it's the same graph, it's just divided, and then it gives you box plots to sort of see where the median range of each bin is. This reveals the nuances of the pattern. We can clearly see the overall downward trajectory with a very large discontinuity between 1650 and 1700. While not all period breaks evidence the same very clear and very striking magnitude of this particular shift, most are statistically significant in their differences from each other. What this metric seems to indicate then is the disappearance of the periphery of the English drama over time. Rather than suggesting significant structural changes to the core of the play, the largest influence in the Gini coefficient, as we have seen, is the presence of a very large periphery whose members rarely speak, and more importantly, rarely interact with the center of power, and who therefore bring down the Gini coefficient for the entire play. Over time, then, this periphery disappears as casts get smaller and actions takes place among an increasingly more tightly knit set of characters. Servants, retainers, guards, acquaintances, and messengers, so important during the early modern period, disappear with increasing regularity in the later periods, echoing the reduced function such figures had in society itself, as dramas move, following Habermasian logic, from the throne room to the drawing room, becoming more personal and intimate rather than mythic, political, religious, or personal. Looking at the Gini coefficients per author, we can see the outsized effects of this historical transformation on the canon. The most drastic difference is between Shakespeare, whose plays favor a large supporting periphery cast, and Jonson, whose low Gini coefficients suggest a smaller cast with more emphasis on the core characters. Interestingly, while Behn, Dryden, and Fielding echo the historical pattern that we've seen, Baillie, again in blue, looks a lot more like Shakespeare in her use of a large core periphery divide than she does like her contemporaries. Now, the percentage of characters in the top quartile of the eigenvector centrality distribution tells an equally striking and parallel story. Although the relative regularity of this measurement makes it less immediately apparent, there is a constant historical increase in the percentage of characters in the top quartile of the eigenvector centrality scores. Again, we can see this play out on the level of authors against the historical backdrop. While the falling Gini coefficients speak to the disappearance of the periphery, this metric of protagonism tells us what happens to the remaining core. Rather than follow the same pattern of the early modern period with a few very highly central characters, the disappearance of the periphery means that more centrality is allocated between the core characters. This speaks not just to the increasing size of the core, but more importantly, to the tendency of having plays that feature multiple subnetworks, each with their own protagonist, indicated by eigenvector centrality. In plays with a single network, it's easy for one character to dominate. But in a play whose action is divided between competing communities, each community can have its own central figure, again leading to the distribution of what I'm calling protagonism among multiple characters. As we can see from the box plot, if we can tell the protagonist of an early modern drama by his or her high eigenvector centrality compared to the rest of the cast, then by the 17th century, the single protagonist has been dispersed between multiple characters who all evidence a high eigenvector centrality, distributing the function of the protagonist and/or the antagonist among a growing number of central characters. Drawing on the typologies that I laid out above, this indicates that plays over time are less likely to feature a single central character or cluster of characters, and depend more on densely connected communities, each featuring prominent characters in their own right. If we segment the plays by author instead of period, we can see the effects on each dramatist. Shakespeare has an astonishingly low eigenvector centrality, revealing how many of his plays depend upon just one or two central characters. The history plays, Hamlet, Lear, Othello. Whereas Jonson, by contrast, seems to feature many more dispersed groups of characters, more so than either Dryden or Benn. If the historical trend is towards multiple communities, Jonson seems well ahead of the curve. It's worthwhile noting, by the way, that the outliers in Shakespeare, for example, this one with the highest eigenvector percentage, is in fact Twelfth Night, perhaps the most decentralized of all of Shakespeare's plays. So if the Gini coefficient and the percentage of characters in the top quartile of eigenvector centrality speak to the protagonist of the play, then betweenness centrality, as I've indicated already, speaks to what I'm calling the mediatedness of the drama. That is, if a high betweenness centrality indicates a character that mediates other characters' interactions, such that they have to pass through her, then the scaled maximum betweenness centrality of a dramatic network overall, which measures the relative importance of bridging characters, indicates the extent to which this mediating function is important to the drama as a whole. In the two distributions of betweenness centrality, which I've normalized and plotted here, we can see that while Henry V on the left, there's a very large gap, again, between Henry V and the rest of the cast, indicating his relative importance as a bridging character. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, on the other hand, on the right, the distribution curve is much less steep, indicating that the mediating function, as we've already seen, is less routed through a single character and more distributed among groups of mediators, leading to the lower maximum betweenness centrality overall. The individual networks bear this out again. In Henry V, the high maximum betweenness centrality of 26.76 reveals the extent to which the entire play and all of its action is mediated through a single character. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the mediatedness has fallen to 15.39, indicating that while there are still important mediating characters, the responsibility for connecting the disparate networks falls more evenly on a group of characters, Bottom, for example, and Theseus, Titania, and Puck. Puck is interesting because he also mediates the play to the audience. Finally, in The Way of the World, the very, very low score of 4.99 indicates the extent to which most characters play a role in mediating the action as they move between the various subnetworks that make up the social fabric of the drawing room comedy. Moving again to the corpus overall and measuring the relative importance of the bridging characters, we can see that like the Gini coefficient and opposite to the quartile eigenvector percentage, the mediatedness of the drama undergoes a large reduction. The maximum betweenness centrality, the relative importance of the bridging character, decreases across the century very quickly from 1590 to 1640, and then more slowly across the remaining 2.5 centuries. We see this even more clearly in the position of authors against the backdrop of history, and again, even more so in grouping the plays into the 50-year increments. The average maximum betweenness centrality in a play drops by over 750 across even just the 16th century. Again, the largest discontinuity lies between 1650 and 1700. There's clearly a lasting effect on the structure of dramatic networks from the Puritan shuttering of the theaters during the Interregnum. The English drama that returns during the Restoration is evidently not the same as the English stage before Cromwell. Thinking through the morphology of the plays, however, overall historical decrease is not a surprising result. As we've seen, the Gini coefficient of eigenvector centrality increases, indicating that the formal structure of the play moves away from central characters connecting disparate communities and more towards interconnected neighborhoods. If there are less separate communities, then logically there is less of a need for a single character to bridge the difference between them. We can see this effect within the single authors, where Shakespeare has a much higher betweenness centrality than the other authors, the highest being, of course, Henry V, whereas we have seen almost all communication between characters goes through the king. Jonson is again ahead of the historical curve, if not as low as Benn or Dryden. Eigenvector centrality or protagonist centrality increases, while betweenness or mediating centrality decreases. The historical transformation seems clear. Plays move from forms that feature a single protagonist, bridging multiple communities or characters, to interwoven communities of central characters. To some extent, these changes align with genre. If we measure not authors or periods, but instead genres against each other, here a subselection of plays who indicate their genre in their title, there is a clear difference between comedies, histories, and tragedies along the three axes I've outlined above. While history and tragedy seem to share similar morphological relationships between their cores and their peripheries, as indicated by their similar Gini coefficients or eigenvector centrality, comedies are structurally much more different, having a much lower Gini coefficient or a smaller periphery relative to the core than the other two genres. The p-values indicate the sharp difference between comedy and history, or between comedy and tragedy. Similarly, comedy is also an outlier in its percentage of characters with a high eigenvector centrality. Although history and tragedy evidence a greater difference according to this metric, comedy again is statistically significantly different from either. As they lack a large periphery, comedies distribute the function of the protagonist much more equally among a number of central characters embedded in different networks. Accordingly, then, they also have a much lower scaled maximum betweenness centrality, as they feature more characters navigating more networks. But mediatedness of the play is also dispersed between more characters, leaving no one character with the bulk of the responsibility, as in tragedy history. In some ways, then, the historical dimension is aligned with the generic reconfiguration. Over time, as they become more distributed in their protagonism, as they lose their periphery, and as they are subdivided into multiple competing networks of interaction, plays become more structurally comedic. Again, as they leave the throne room and enter the drawing room, the native space of comedy, even tragedies look morphologically more like comedies. So protagonism, the tendency of plays to distribute the role of the protagonist among many characters, increases over time as mediatedness, the importance of a single mediating character, decreases. You can see the convergence historically here. As these two measurements approach each other, they converge on a new dramatic form. We should expect to see the difference between them, as we observed in Midsummer Night's Dream, decrease accordingly. But when we visualize the largest change between a single character's eigenvector and betweenness centrality per play, we find the opposite. Contrary to what the historical trends predicts, the difference between these two metrics actually increases, and quite significantly. Looking at the graph of 50-year periods, we can see the distinct increase, particularly, as always, between 1650 and 1700. So what is causing this counterintuitive effect? The answer lies in how this difference is calculated. Rather than across the play overall, the calculation measures the change in the two centralities per character. That is, regardless of the increasing or decreasing centralities of the plays overall, the roles of the individual characters shift. Take, for example, the network of, here, Richard Brinsley Sheridan's late 18th century comedy, A School for Scandal. In the network measuring eigenvector centrality, right here, Joseph, Sir Peter, and Lady Sneerwell stand out as the most central characters. When we switch to betweenness centrality, they pale in comparison to Charles. This is a fact that we've seen before. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the two functions, protagonist and bridging character, are displaced from a single character into two different characters, as they are here. This is the change that we can trace across time. In Sheridan's play, it's critical to note that the function of the protagonist itself is split between multiple characters, between Sir Peter and his sons, and between Joseph, who seems to be the good son, but is revealed as the opportunistic social climber, and Charles, whose actions are vindicated in the drama. The increasing complexity of the dramatic communities demands the disaggregation of these roles. As the morphology of the play changes, the dual roles of the protagonist and the mediating character are divided. Henry V is the exemplar of the early modern play, with its central bridging character and protagonist in one. Later plays are more likely to feature a set of characters central to their cliques and different characters who mediate the action between these groups. This goes hand in hand with the historical turn to densely interconnected networks of individual neighborhoods. The turn, as I have said, from the throne room to the drawing room, that the other measurements revealed. So where does this leave this question that I started with, that I posed early on in this paper on Schlegel's argument for the romantic reappropriation of the early modern drama? And how can these large-scale transformations aid us in answering meaningful local questions of the scale of dramatic history? Returning to the graph of the difference between the two centralities, it's not simply the case that all of the plays of the early modern period fall into the model of Henry V. Instead, there is a distinct group of outliers whose difference, this group, whose difference is higher than any other plays until the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the Romantic period. That is, there is a group of plays there that look a lot like Romantic plays of a couple centuries later. Looking carefully at this group of outliers, however, it's not Shakespeare who prefigures the Romantic dramatic form, but Ben Jonson. In, for example, his 1616 comedy, The Devil is an Ass, the eigenvector centrality identifies Fitztrottell, the wealthy and fashionable fop, and Meercraft, the con artist who tries to relieve Fitztrottell of his riches, as the primary characters. But in a pre-configuration of romantic dramatic form, it's neither of those characters that mediates the action with a high betweenness centrality. Instead, it's Pug, the inexperienced devil, the fool who seeks and fails to even prove his identity to Fitztrottell, that has the highest betweenness centrality and who mediates the action between the other characters. As we witness in the graphs of the individual metrics, Shakespeare, with some exceptions, is very much a playwright of his time. Schlegel is right that the early modern period of England does share formal characteristics across time with his vision of romantic poetry, but from these results, it's Jonson, not Shakespeare, who on the whole proves to be a forerunner of romantic authorship. And yet, as we've seen, 19th century dramatic history itself is not that simple. While Jonson looks overall much more like a romantic dramatist than does Shakespeare, Joanna Baillie's metrics, from her protagonism to her mediatedness, resemble Shakespeare's much more than Jonson's. Of course, this is evident from our understanding of literary history. By Schlegel's very appropriation of Shakespeare, and in his translation, Shakespeare is transformed into a romantic author, even as the Romantic movement in Germany reshapes itself to accommodate his work. Baillie, then, is a playwright caught between the global movement of dramatic history that is shedding the dramatic periphery and distributing its actions among a subnetwork, with each with its own protagonist, and the local romantic phenomenon that looks to Shakespeare as a model for romantic dramatic morphology. That the networks and the metrics I've discussed here today can reveal both phenomena simultaneously, the local and the global, speaks to their power and utility. The complex transformation of the English stage, even outside of language or stagecraft, but just in its structural morphology, reveals historical patterns that defy local logic, even while specific periods alter their own relationship to history. What is evident, though, is the power of the network and its associated metrics to help us unpack this complex and rich history and shed new light on the transformations.
Questions?
Yes, that was fascinating, Mark. So one thing I was curious about, can you go back to the slide with the Gini coefficients plotted over time, sort of the diachronic one? I was curious about just so some of them look like they were at 0. Do you know what was causing the ones that just had the exact 0 value?
Between this. There's a lot of slides in this presentation. This one?
Or one back, maybe? Yeah, it's like those down at the very bottom down there.
Right, so they are ones in which all of the characters have the exact same centrality, which means they're ones with 2 or 3 characters who talk amongst them evenly. Most of them don't rest exactly on 0, although there are a couple that snuck in, particularly in the early modern period, that are like single-person plays. So if you only have one character, the Gini coefficient is 0.
Right.
But some of them, the really, really low ones that are almost at are masks that feature like 2 or 3 characters who do talking.
Yeah, well, one of the quick thing about that graph, I was just curious too. So that, just sort of eyeballing it, like it looks like there might almost be sort of an uptick on the right side.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So is that, yeah, so is that like, did you try fitting like a quadratic term in the regression to see if it sort of pops up at all?
It does, but the R-squared values are not good. I mean, when you do bin-to-bin, the an ANOVA of each of these with a Tukey, these do, interestingly, but these do not look statistically different.
Okay, cool.
So maybe if I had a 20th century corpus place, I could continue tracing it, but at the moment I'm not willing to.
Yeah, because a couple did seem like visually it did seem to back.
Is there a database or data that would allow you to analyze, because this is a very literary perspective of when things were written, but to analyze what was being performed, so from an audience perspective, a view of centrality?
I didn't say that, and I should have. Thank you for that. So what I did here was take from the really horrible XML the date of first performance as the date of the play, unless it wasn't available, in which case I took the date of first publication. So for all the Shakespeare's, the date of performance, not the date of like the first folio. I think it would actually be really interesting. What I'd really like to do exactly along that axis is to look at particular plays that are reperformed across time, right? So like examine not just early modern Shakespeare, but like 18th century Shakespeare and 19th century Shakespeare, both to identify plays that have like a really long life versus ones that are like super historically contingent, but also because there are so many radical changes to like King Lear, right, which turns into a comedy at some point in the 18th century, which is kind of amazing. I'd love to examine these metrics in the rewriting of those plays based on their dates of performance. The short answer to your question is that I've gathered the performance when I can. It's just a lot harder. I've been in touch with a group actually in Glasgow who have a lot of performance metrics, and I'm going to try and incorporate that into. But I'm still not there.
Mark, this was a great presentation. Thank you. And I have two questions, one related to the last one, and one a more pedagogical question, maybe. Yeah. Related to the last one, can you envision any way to incorporate changes in staging and stage directions as written in the plays into this? And then the larger, more amorphous question is, all right, so I'm teaching a class where I'm going to be looking at a few individual plays rather than large corpuses. How would I incorporate what I have learned here or into having students and myself look at these plays individually? How do I read something, how do I read School for Scandal differently in light of this?
Both really good questions. So as part of the parsing, like I said, I collect stage directions in order to do the assignations.
Right.
I haven't done anything with them. I mean, I don't have a good excuse as to why, other than they're a different kind of thing. For sure. So since I'm interested in looking at sort of the plays as social universes, I mean, the one ways which I've experimented in trying to include them is to improve the kind of networks that I'm making, right? So that it'll say, character X, 2 characters Y and Z. So I try and do that, but I could see making networks out of actions. I think that would be really cool. They would be different in kind from the networks here, so that I'd have to have a whole new set of metrics that explain that. I'm comfortable making the segregation, but I like the idea. In terms of pedagogy, so I've taught 18th century, or courses on restoration and 18th century drama. And what I really like about this is it's clarified the way in which the comedy, especially the structural form of the comedy, becomes the dominant form even when the play is a tragedy, right? So when you compare something like Cato, which is a tragedy, which is like seriously a tragedy, the structural morphology, particularly between these vectors, right, looks much more like a comedy. You have the character who is the conspirator that mediates between the groups, whereas Juba, who's nominally the protagonist of the play, only stays located within one particular sub-network. So what I find is that having this kind of historical scope gives a way to explain what the difference is between something like Cato and something like Venice Preserved. At a very local level, Venice Preserved looks much more like Shakespeare. It's from it. Whereas Cato is reworking the comedic form, very popular through the Restoration, into a tragedy. So I find that having that global perspective enables me to contextualize the local transformation when I'm teaching.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Hey, this is really cool. I was curious if you had other thoughts about quantifying characterhood that go beyond some of the measures you used so far, and also whether once you look at these betweenness characters or protagonist characters, if they have more literary sort of characteristics that overlap rather than just networked characteristics.
So you're talking in some ways about moving from structural aspect into what the characters say.
If are there more relationships between that or other things?
That's an interesting question. I've thought about branching out into semantics, right? So once you identify, because this is one of the things that this doesn't capture. As I said early on, I made the conscious decision to measure the number of times characters talk rather than the number of words they say, which does some interesting things. So like a servant who pops up a lot and says one word has actually a pretty high centrality versus a character who shows up, says 500 words and then disappears, never to be heard from again. So there are some different effects when you change that and start looking at what the characters actually say. I haven't done it, but it's actually a really good idea. Obviously, the other thing that I'm conflating here and doing it again deliberately is the protagonist and the antagonist, right? Looking at the genesis, the evolution of dramatic conflict, romantic relationships, all of that are inherent here, which I haven't worked out a way to sort of work into this analysis, but I'm super eager to explore.
Just one really quick question. Yeah. You said you looked at directionality of the who was talking to whom. Did anything come out of that?
Nothing that would surprise you, I am sorry to say. In comedies, women are talked to a lot more than they are talking. That's the biggest sort of result. The most obvious one. There are some local level things that I've seen in particular networks that are kind of surprising, but sort of at scale analysis, it's actually the gender breakdown of who talks to who. When it's not a class breakdown, when it's not like the aristocracy to the lower classes, there's a really gender dimension to imbalances in conversation.
That's stunning paper. I really it changes the way you think about drama. But I mean, I've said this to you before, so I'll say it very quickly. I mean, that fascinating restoration thing.
Yeah.
There must be a paper in there about how having professional women actors in the company changes who is willing to play what and for how long. An all-male company spreading 4 or 5 parts around an individual actor is going to behave differently to a company with 2 or 3 leading women in it who want to focus on main parts. So that's a factor. But can I ask you a slightly more challenging question about process,
please?
Which is, I mean, you talk about stage directions, and those of us that work on early playtexts know that they're often non-existent or minimal. So in a sense, by using the database, you're relying on editorial decisions about people who've edited a text at particular points in time. So isn't there a danger that it becomes self-reinforcing, that a particular era's conception of what a speech is built into your core data? So what an aside is, for instance, changes quite fundamentally. I speak to you, you say, haha, he says that, but I think not. And that doesn't come out as an aside in some editions, but does in others. I mean, could you even begin to make sense of those kind of oddities?
No, it's a really important question. And one that I'm actually comfortable with to a certain degree. Because the hardest thing for the process that I have to take, the thing that causes the most difficulty, is in restoration comedies, you very, very often have 2 characters who are watching 2 other characters do something. And these 2 characters will talk to each other, and these 2 characters will talk to each other, but they don't, and these 2 don't know that there's no interaction between them. So he'll talk, she'll talk to him, she'll talk to him, and it'll be super confusing. And I think there is a sense at which, as play interactions, that doesn't happen as much in Shakespeare's. I mean, it happens in Shakespeare. Rarely happens in Jonson. It really doesn't happen in a lot of modern dramas. I think there's a sense by which the increasing complexity of play actions, as stated specifically, echo a kind of increasing complexity of social interactions. And again, this speaks to that division into multiple competing networks of characters rather than a single one. So by including the directions in the way that I'm parsing the play, I think I'm capturing that increasing complexity, which I agree totally reinforces the results that I'm getting, but in a way that I'm at the moment comfortable with, although I'd be happy to argue.
So thank you for this. Following up on Gabe's pedagogical question, I'm wondering, it was interesting to see bottom centrality, not a figure that we normally think of as the center of the play. How would looking at that change the way you would teach Midsummer Night's Dream?
You presume that I've taught Midsummer Night's Dream that much. Well, in some respects, it you know, go plan a class in a Midsummer Night's Dream. So I have taught classes, as I said to Gabe, on 18th century drama. And what I find fascinating is that there are frequently specific roles that characters inhabit who have can be measured along these metrics. So, for example, in plays that are tragedies with a character who has a really high betweenness centrality and not a high eigenvector centrality, that character is almost always the leader of a conspiracy. Like, it's a great conspiracy detector, right? And it makes sense when you think about it, because you've got a character who's talking to this whole group of people that are going to emerge at some point and try and kill everybody, but no one else knows that they're a group of people. So in that case, what you can do with these kinds of metrics is explore how that morphology shapes the way in which the action of the play is carried out, or how the characters talk to and relate to each other. And I think with bottom, for example, I'm really interested in the bottom Titania thing in Midsummer Night's Dream, mostly because I think fools in Shakespeare, particularly Shakespearean comedies, act a lot like bottom. And that interfaces, I think, very strongly with the Shakespearean criticism that talks about how the fool mediates, I mean, they don't use the word mediate, but the fool interacts with both the people in the play and the audience, right? It's sort of the audience's way of understanding the action, and gives and allows the audience to not participate, but to understand the action as vocalized through a character. Thinking particularly Lear, As You Like It. And I think bottom, interestingly for me, fulfills the exact same function in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And by showing a network of As You Like It and A Midsummer Night's Dream, you can see that the fool character has the same measurement, right? So it's small eigenvector, all of a sudden when you switch to betweenness, explodes into a high betweenness. So it's a way for me, in thinking through Shakespeare, for example, to relate these kinds of archetypes of characters that fulfill really similar dramatic functions to each other in a way that's immediately sort of impactful and exists outside of reading through the play and sort of figuring out its function that way.
So at the beginning you showed a network of David Copperfield, and with the understanding that those networks are much harder to form than dramatic networks.
Yes.
Nonetheless, would you speculate a bit on what you would find in character networks in novels, in particularly the 18th and going into the 19th century? Are they structurally undergoing the same kind of transformation, or are they taking over a role that drama is abandoning? What's going on?
Well, I mean, part of the problem is that I'd have to look at 17th century novels.
One doesn't want to do that, but
One can argue that there are no 17th century, right?
a handful.
Yeah, they're English 19th century. No, they exist. I mean, it's sort of caught up in that kind of historical transformation, which is the emergence of long-form prose fiction as novel itself, which we have a whole other project about. No, I'm really interested in that actually, because I see that transformation happening later. But I'm really interested in that sense is 18th century to 19th century, because I think the opposite happens, right? There's a kind of constricted world in the 18th century novel, particularly in something like Pamela, which takes place in a very small, geographic area, or Evelina that takes place within a constrained social circle, or even a picaresque novel where you have a central group of characters that meet some, versus like a Dickensian novel in which you have many different networks. So something like Bleak House is much different than Tom Jones, for example, in that there are multiple simultaneous networks, but it's grown so much that the core periphery divide has transformed, I think, even more radically here. On the other hand, I could see a way in which something like a picaresque novel has a really big periphery and a small core.
That's kind of what I was
and
thinking.
Yet, something Dickensian or later would have like a smaller.
Well, it's like overlaying, it's like combining, I mean, the
Okay, so we have to
multi-plot
do
thing
it.
is like combining a bunch of,
All right.
extremely unequal core
So
periphery.
you go make character lists for 18th century, 19th century novels, and then we can.
Right into that one.
Look what happens when you ask an interesting question.
Could I jump in here or just put myself in the queue?
Oh, sorry.
Peripheral vision. I'm from the libraries, so I'm wondering how you plan to persist this data, and if in your practice you have ways that other researchers can collaborate with you on the algorithm or model, and collaborate with you on the data over time.
I do not, because I am not very good at that, because because of the way in which I interact with the DH field. So something like this, for example, I am hoping to write up for publication. So the preservation of this argument will be done in a very traditional, either paper or online-based journal form. In terms of the data itself, I am prepping the code. I still need to tweak it a little bit so that I can release it on GitHub, so that other people will be able to. I've already shared it with other collaborators who are working on similar things. And we've talked about ways that we can improve it or not improve it. Scott Weingart, for example, is convinced that instead of looking forward then back, back and forward, I should look forward then back. I disagree, but we can have that discussion because we both have access to it.
Yeah.
So that, in terms of code availability, is a plan. Beyond that, with the specific data here, I'm happy to make it available, but I do not have data yet because until fairly recently, I didn't have a lot of data to worry about. But it's something to keep in mind.
One thing that interests me is the ability to have arguments or discussions based on a shared model that can be changed.
Yeah.
So here the conclusions are tightly coupled to the specific algorithm, are tightly coupled to the specific data.
Yep.
And how can those dependencies be loosened?
It's a great plug for the conference that the Literary Lab is having in April on results in the digital humanities in English and history, in which we're going to present our Modeling Dramatic Networks project, which reverses this project. So instead of taking real plays and measuring them, we take measurements, set them, and produce simulated plays, and then talk about what that does in terms of reconfiguring understanding of how dramatic networks form. So, April 14th.
I hope we have time. Ryan, who is present virtually, has a question. Is that okay?
Fine. I'm always happy to hear from you.
Yep, 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to rattle off with
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
No.
Hello, can you hear me?
No. It's from the sky. You have to save it then. Sorry, Ryan.
Ryan knows where to find me.
Yeah. Very stimulating, wonderful, brilliant, as always. Let's say thank you to Mark Algee-Hewitt.